Right. Hafere todos hamzo. Estigui nuevo un episode Fanachu. We have another episode of Fanachu here. And Guahui host Mizu Talo si Michael Luhan Bavakwa. And Fanachu is a Guam-based podcast, but one of the things that we have always strived for is to be more Marianist focused in how we think about things, in how we think about our future. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. There's colonial divisions that have divided the people, and there are certain realities that we struggle with today, and there's even some you know some I think we can get into this, but on some people feel there's some ladzunai, guaha ladzunai. People feel it on different sides about this or that. And so if we are talking about reunification of the Marianas, which we are going to be talking about today, we need to get into all of this stuff because it's not just the colonial history. It's not just sort of the political realities, but it's also how we as cousins, manietlu, mamparentes, how we are going to relate to each other, how we have not just how we related to the past, but how are we going to look at each other today, and how are we going to look ahead to a better Marianas, hopefully, a united Marianas, hopefully. And so I'm very excited because, I asked some of my friends went to the Making Waves conference in Saipan recently, and I said, I said, Josh, Annie Faye, Jesse, can you find somebody in the CNMI who's interested in sharing their thoughts on reunification with Guam, reunifying the Marianas? And they said, all right. And I also said, can you get me some apigigi because I'm tautau Guamnai, and we are at this point, it's like in the DNA. When they're doing CSI Micronesia, they're going to do the DNA test. And how do you know? How do you know this is a Guam person? Because they have the gene for asking for a pigiki from somebody from Saipan. And so, and so I asked him, and then Josh Laurenti, it's at Luta. Josh, he came back and he said, Zeno Deleon Guerrero Jr., right? Zeno Deleon Guerrero Jr. And I was like, of course. Oh my goodness, we were at Right to Democracy in the States, and in New York a few years ago. And Josh was like, he is interested, and I was like, oh my goodness, this will be a wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad Gof Magof Sunai na unaccepte este. I'm so glad that you decided to come on for this conversation about reunification from Tautau Guahan, Tautau CNMI. Si Zeus Masi Purifanatun Mizu. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miget, for having me on the Fanachu podcast. Really happy to be here. And so, just for everyone, my name is Zeno Camacho de Leon Guerrero Jr. From the island of Saipan. I'm an educator here, activist advocate. And I'm just really excited to be talking about the future of the Marianas. Is reunification the future? I would hope so, but there's a lot of finer details that we'll hopefully talk about today about how that could possibly look like. And I know a lot of people have a lot of opinions or ideas or questions and fears, but I definitely think that this is the space talking about it is something we should be doing, right? So that we can really map out what all of our futures will look like. So I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, Biba. No, si Zeus Masi. No, I appreciate this so much because for me, I think that the discussion around reunification, it's happening in some places, it's not happening in other places, and there's a big gap. There are some people who feel like reunification, it's a given. Debido mas sucede esti, debido matokwi esti. But then for other people, it's something where it doesn't enter their minds at all. Like it's not anything that's on their radar. And so what I love about sort of, bringing out this more into conversation is like we need to talk about it because the issues of our division are around us. Let's
Mm,
think more about the possibilities for our reunification. I mean, everyone everyone laments the fact of how expensive it is to get from Guam to the CNMI and back.
Mm.
And so, but what always frustrates me though is that, an obvious next step is, well, how can we talk about integration? Even if you aren't sure about how to politically integrate, how can we talk about economically integrating to to bring down that price, to make it easier for us to travel so that we can visit each other. So I don't have to bother people to bring me a pigigi. I can go and get the pigigi myself.
I know. I was gonna say those $500 to $600 flights to United are outrageous, right? And that's one of, it's a very surface level issue, but it has real ramifications for, our especially for us in the CNMI, our medical care, often first place of treatment for most of us here, if it's not available on island, is to go over to Guahan. And that already is just such a huge obstacle for many families to get life-saving care. Much less, getting your PGG, which is also, I would say, important. Um, but, just makes me think about how, yeah, when we have these conversations about reunification, of course, everyone's minds jump towards the big kind of political and what that means for our relationship with the United States. But, reunification, like many other things, doesn't happen overnight, and it maybe shouldn't always happen in like one big go, right? It's a process that should be gradual, right? And maybe we can think about, like you mentioned, outside of the political realm, what are other ways we can reunify or more closely unify ourselves in our islands? Because, the biggest thing is our ancestors never had this problem of like travel amongst each other. They just went on their boats and they sailed and they called it a day, right? But we ourselves as people put on that invisible border between us, right? I mean, yeah, there's a legal border. You can call it an economic border, a political border. But when you really just think about it, it's an open ocean, right? Nothing's really going to stop us besides ourselves, right? The laws, the whatever boundaries we have, those were set by us, right? And we, you know, darn as well should have the power to take it away if it's going against things that we want or we need, right?
Mm,
And so just thinking about it in that sense of like we have these man-made, man-imposed boundaries between ourselves, and why are we continuing to keep those in place when really we have the power to take them away,
mm.
right?
No, that's such a good point. That's that's such a it's such an important point. I really love the way that you first, it's such an important reminder that, reunification, if we only think about it in that big way, that, if we only think about the signing statement where the governors of the islands come together and sign, and oh my goodness, all this stuff has happened. Well, then, yeah, maybe that's a tall order. That's going to take a lot of work to get there. And maybe if you're only thinking about that, then, it's easier to just not think about it. It's easier to think about something else. But if you focus on the other things that divide us, and I like the way you said that even if there are these legal, political kind of borders, sort of we still can give them meaning. We still have a say in how much they divide us. And so that's such a powerful point because the division between Guam and the CNMI can be very strict and severe, or it can be very loose. It can
Mm-hmm.
be something that we don't see as being very strong. But we can all. So, if, for example, the United States colonizers before divided, we can either start to kind of pull that down, or we can find ways to reinforce it,
Mm-hmm.
find ways to kind of reimagine it. And so I wanted to ask now, and Esti and I, Hita na dosa, we're just speaking for ourselves, in your experience, in your impressions in the CNMI, do people that you've interacted with, your family, friends, do you feel like there's an interest in reunification, or do you feel like it's something that people might be resistant to, or they're just not interested in? What are your impressions that you get from sort of your community around you?
That's a really good question. And yeah, we are really only just two people, right? And we don't, try to speak on behalf of our whole respective islands, or I'll put it in quotes, territories, right? Air quotes. But I would say I've encountered the whole spectrum of opinion when it comes to reunification. Um, I would say in a lot of the advocate social justice circles, um, a lot of people want to reunify, right? Because they look at what's happening to our islands in terms of like a geopolitical sense with the United States military, its pseudo proxy war with the People's Republic of China, right? And the hyper militarization of the islands, and they just feel as though we could better secure our environment, our people, our culture if we were, stronger together as opposed to being politically divided. Um, However, I've also met a lot of people here in the CNMI who are very against, a nice way to put it is cautious, but I would say just vocally against reunification, just because there's an understanding and a belief, right? And there is truth to it, that there are certain CNMI specific uh, customs, traditions, laws, that there is a fear of losing those protections when we reunify with Guam. And we can get into this a lot more in a bit, but it's specifically Article 12 for the CNMI Constitution, our land non-alienation clauses, which is, I would say, one of the, if not the biggest stark difference that we have, compared to Guam, right? Um, and then I guess the other thing I would, you know, put in is that the CNMI recognizes two indigenous peoples to the Marianas, the Chamorros and the Carolinians and Refalawash. And so anytime, the topic of reunification comes up, and this was also something that came up in a recent Right to Democracy summit, the one that was held in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, where, there is a fear, that what would happen when you have integrate a bigger Chamorro population like Guahan, right, all into the CNMI or with the CNMI, and would that further marginalize or jeopardize the sort of already kind of tense status that Carolinians and Refalawash have in the CNMI, right? Because I would say, and people even now still have a what is it, two different opinions about if there is tension between Chamorros and Carolinians and Refalawash in the CNMI. Some people would say there's no tension. Some people would say there is, right? But it's I would say safe to say that there are moments of tension, right? And I think those would be further intensified if reunification gets talked about more, which is it's not necessarily a bad thing. We need to work through our tensions, right, or our issues and conflict so that we can heal and move forward together. But those are the two main things for people who are either vocally against or cautious about reunification. Um, and then there are other folks who just haven't, it's not even a thought that crosses their mind. And I don't blame them when we are currently dealing with a budget crisis here in the CNMI and, a potential economic collapse. Reunifying with Guam is probably the last thing on people's minds, right? Among many other things. So definitely the whole spectrum of opinion from people who um, was it highly support it and want to move forward with it, people who are super cautious or vocally against, and people who have never thought about it at all in their lives. Um, and you have all of those people here in the CNMI. And I've talked to people who are all in all three camps, and it's definitely it would be I mean, it just makes me more excited to see how we could move forward in this conversation, right? Just having people who are just at very different places mentally about this issue in question, and like how can we, what could be our answer? And I don't really have a very good answer. But I'm hoping that our conversation moves the needle forward, and hopefully other people who listen to this also start thinking about how do I feel about this and how will I get impacted by this? Because I think it's very important to ask.
Mm,
But yeah, I'm curious about what have you seen on Guahan?
mm. It's I would say that it's similar to how you described. People who are engaged on these issues are, of course, much more likely to talk about reunification. People who are activists, people who are scholars, cultural practitioners, people who kind of see reunification as something that can solve a problem, like you said, and it could be a problem in the past. It could lead to healing, it could lead to decolonization, and or it could lead to a strategic advantage economically, politically. So for those who kind of are paying more attention to regional events, global events, and our own history, they know that they tend to feel that reunification is good. Reunification is something that we should be working towards, whether it happens sooner, whether it happens later. Everyone kind of feels like it should happen. But your average person, though, is kind of your average person will kind of they'll feel different sorts of things because they might use their own sort of prejudices to understand the issue in the absence of any actual knowledge of the issue. Like, so, and when I say prejudices, it doesn't necessarily only mean like racial or ethnic, but it could just be like their prejudices because they might feel, oh, the CNMI is so small, they would be a drain on us. And so not even thinking then that like that's not even, you know, that's this person, somebody who says that probably doesn't know much about economy, doesn't know much about the region or any of the issues, but is just assuming that, oh, they're small, they're poor. They don't even have a movie theater anymore. And look at us. And so you feel through your bias, your prejudice, you imagine them in that way. And so you push them down and you push yourself up. And so what I find is that some people, when they're asked this, they'll use that. They're not thinking, they don't know anything, but it's just that, and then in the past, but it's not as strong anymore. There used to be some people who would say that who would be against reunification because of the issues of grievances, feeling like World War II or feeling like other sorts of things. And this is one thing that we can definitely, putting out the family business, for example, is sometimes in these conversations, like you could be talking to somebody who's like fancy pants economist, fancy pants lawyer, senator, even governor, and you start talking about this issue, and then they'll share a story about, oh, my cousin in Guam or oh, my cousin in Saipan, they used to tease me because of this, or they used to tease me because of that. And so it's so interesting how some people like feel this issue through those grievances or those pain, the sort of the drama of our of us being sort of this family of islands that have this history where we've never dealt with the trauma or the drama of our past. And so, yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts on that because that's definitely one of the things that's always fascinated me is because you could be having like a like a conversation with all these people where you're talking about economic possibilities, political stuff, and then somebody will be like, "Oh man, when I spent one summer in Saipan, all my cousins teased me."
Mm.
Believe in reunification. Or somebody says, oh, when I went to Guam and I went to high school in Guam, all the people in Guam made me feel like my I was bad because of my accent, or I was stupid because of my accent or something. And then that will then trickle up into their thinking on the issue. So, but I want to hear your thoughts because that's one
No,
thing that
yeah.
intrigued me.
And so I would say, what is it? And I'm trying to recollect, because I've often, traveled to Guam myself and met with family and then heard from other people who have, done the back and forth a lot. I think what you say has truth to it in the sense of like, I don't know if it's necessarily good or bad, but there's, I don't know if it's a grievance, but it's basically a judgment, right? And this goes again back to our um not biases, you were saying another word. Um, but there's a difference, right? Because we've just been so historically separated, we've grown apart in different ways. And so there's always, in my mind, about who gets to claim tomorrow, for example, right? And you
Mhm.
see this playing out a lot, especially in the diaspora, I would say, where you often, and I don't think anyone means to be malicious, right? But a lot of people would brand Chamorro food, the food of Guam, right? And but it's like anytime I see that, my critical thinking hat comes on and says, no, 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 that's Guam and the CNMI, right? Like I want to go in and correct you. What's little things like that, where it's like who gets to claim Chamorro? And let's not even get into the whole spelling of the word tomorrow, because I think that's also another thing that plays into this now, isn't it? Because a lot of people in the scene might have their opinions, right? We have our two official different spellings of tomorrow. But even pushing that aside, it's what is it? You know, and the thing is, each island is actually kind of different. And I'm not surprised we have these little grievances with each other. We call each other sister islands, right? And like sisters or just like siblings in general, we're going to fight, right? It's kind of you know, to think that we aren't gonna have differences and we're not gonna like mess with each other or be hurt by one another. Like if you think that's never gonna happen, you're living in some kind of fantasy, right? And it's something that happens, it's happening now, it has happened before, right? I would like to say one of the, you were mentioning the bigger grievance from World War II where yeah, and I've heard this before where there's the feeling and perception that Chamorros from the NMI went down during the Japanese occupation and were assisting the Japanese, right? And there was this feeling of betrayal and hurt because of that. And that's honestly really understandable. On the flip side, right, after this whole topic or conversation we're having about reunification, it's not the first time this conversation's been had. We've had referendums, and you're the history buff, and you can probably correct me on how many referendums, but I believe it's at least two, if not more. But I could be wrong. And if I am not mistaken, both times the people of the NMI voted in favor of reunification, but the people of Guam did not. And of course, we could talk about why is that, right? And I think that's important. But although I will say more so the elders now, because those referendums happen in the maybe 50s, 60s, or 70s, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but basically, when those referendums were made and those decisions were held, and basically the CNMI or the NMI back then got basically the rejection from Guam. We don't want to be together. That was a lot of hurt feelings, right? And that is a big grievance that, the elders who are now elders still kind of have when they look back at that. Anytime we try to bring in this new, in air quotes, new conversation about reunification. They think back to the old conversations and old referendums of reunification, where basically, from their perspective, Guam said, we don't care for you, CNMI, right? We reject you. And I think those feelings kind of got trickled down uh, through the generations to lead to this whole big, when I was growing up, it was a lot more intense of the Saipan and Guam beef, right, or tension between the two islands. But I will say now, especially with the youth, and this is where, I'm an educator and I work with the youth. And so a lot of the kids are now asking, like, why don't we reunify? Like, what is stopping us? Right. And I'm glad that the kids are asking these questions because honestly, I have them too. Um, and they're not plagued by the same biases that um, the elders have when it came to those negative experiences with the previous referendums, right? Um, and so it's helpful to get their fresh perspective, but it's also, I think, helpful to just remember listening to our elders, what they have to say and how they felt during that time. But it's interesting now being in the middle of those two kind of points of contact when it comes to the referendum. Me and this younger generation who don't remember what it was like to be rejected by Guam, and then the elders who very acutely remember voting, wanting to reunify, and then getting a no for an answer. So it's pretty interesting.
No, thank you for bringing that up because it's very, very, very relevant for this. A lot of times people, bring in like the even up until today, historians and people will kind of bring World War II as the main reason, but it's really not anymore. On the C and then on their sort of the CNMI side, the rejection by Guam, I think the last one was in 69. And that had a huge impact then on how the CNMI saw its own progress moving ahead. And so, but one of the I think you bringing this up though bring because as I've done research kind of and tried to kind of look into this because it's harder now because a lot of the leaders like on the Guam side I think almost all of actually now on the Guam side all the leaders at that time have passed away. I think there's still some of the leaders on the CNMI side who were pushing for reunification who are still alive, but it kind of connects to what we're talking about in hearing them discuss it and then hearing why it kind of failed. Because historians usually point to the fact that it was the bad blood, the feelings of hurt, the betrayal from the war as the reason why Guam voted down the reunification. But in truth, part of it was that, at least in my kind of looking back at it and understanding it, part of it was that the leaders of the CNMI or the NMI at that time, because still under the TTP, the Trust Territory, the NMI and Guam both understood that working together, being united they'd be stronger. They'd have, a better chance at getting more from the federal government, that it was a better deal for the CNMI, which was stuck under the trust territory at that point, and had been cut off by CIA bases and other stuff, just like Guam had been cut off by security clearance before. So that the leaders, a lot of them were understanding, like, man, we're facing the same problems. We should work together. And whereas in the CNMI, there was this feeling like that we can get a better deal if we reunite. In Guam, the leaders never did the work of talking to the people about, like, how is this going to be better? How is this going to improve the island? And so a lot of the voters in Guam, and it wasn't a high turnout referendum by any means, because most people didn't understand it or didn't care about it in truth. But it was just this feeling like it'll be a financial burden. They're going to be competing for programs. It's going to increase our taxes, just a lot of like generic stuff that has nothing to do with the issue, but just like the type of thing where more people coming in, oh man, this sucks. And so I think though, like, one of the reasons for me why it's important though to what we've seen now is one of the big differences now is that more work has been done culturally to prepare the communities, which is why we see more people who work in culture, people who work in education, feeling the need to reunify. And that work needs to continue but it needs to get down to more and more of your average people to kind of understand that, like, we know that we used to be one. We know that we're basically in the same place, we're the same archipelago, like we should be one. And so more of it needs to kind of get down to your average person. But a lot of the everyday kind of stereotypes, everyday kind of ignorance can get in the way of that. And you brought up the diaspora, which was a very interesting thing because it's so fascinating. You're right. I see, at least on social media, a lot of the beef, the Guam CNMI beef happening with Chamorros in the States, fighting over like Guam CNMI superiority. It's not as pronounced in the Marianas anymore. But like in the States, it's like people fighting in TikTok comments to the death, like and on Instagram, like people and like, but not as much because I think yeah, anyways, that was, but so one thing you did mention, and I think it's a strong point that sometimes I acknowledge I have struggled with is just sort of the Guam hegemony. We talk about Hawaiian hegemony in the Pacific. There's definitely Guam hegemony. That Guam, what comes from Guam, because there's more Chamorros from Guam, stands in for the Marianas. And so, for example, in the States, there's Guam clubs. But now what we see, thankfully, is a broader focus on Marianas festivals and Chamorro clubs or Marianas clubs, which can be more inclusive. And I'm thankful that, because even for me, one of the things that I've sometimes struggled with is, and people have criticized me, and sometimes I'm not sure how to respond because, for example, me and my brother 10 years ago started the Guam bus to create educational materials like in the Chamorro language. But sometimes people have said that we should call ourselves the Marianas bus. And because and and now thinking now, I think I probably would do that. But 10 years ago, I would feel uncomfortable saying that I could speak for people in the CNMI, like, or that it would be okay for me to say like that I can put myself out there and say like my Chamorro represents people in the CNMI because I wouldn't want to, my Guam Chamorro may not be the same as theirs, or I wouldn't want to offend. I wouldn't want to speak up for the experience of others. And so, but some people have told me since that you should be the Marianas bus. You shouldn't be the Guam bus. And I realize that now, but 10 years ago when we first started, I felt so uncomfortable because I I have a very much a Guam experience. Like whenever I've traveled to like Tinian and Luta and Saipan, like I know I have a Guam experience. And I don't want my experience to like to diminish and stand in for anyone else's because like you were saying, the Guam plate can easily kind of push the CNMI plate off. There's plenty of room for both of them, but it's easy for a lot of people to push the CNMI plate off the table. And so thank you for bringing that up though, because I think that that is one of the things that limits the imagination of some people is that kind of they are just thinking, oh, Guam, 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 Guam. But if you just kind of imagine things a little bit differently, more Marianas, it makes the issue of it makes the issue of reunification easier to imagine. And so I've talked a lot. I wanted to hear your thoughts now.
No, yeah, and I think what is it? A simple way that me and other friends and colleagues, especially in spaces where we're dealing with people or interacting with people who are not from the Marianas. I've started opting to introduce myself as being from and of the Marianas, right? And of course, I'll say I'm specifically from Saipan, I'm Chamorro, right? But starting off, and it's just a really simple thing to add on. Like I'm from the Marianas, the Mariana Islands, where we kind of acknowledge that this whole archipelago is home, right? And I think I would love to see more of that happening, both in Saipan, Luta, Guahan, and also in the diaspora in the United States. Um, but at the same time, the other thing that's picking me at the back of my mind is that, and it's the tough thing when we talk about reunification, right? It's going back to the CNMI specifically acknowledging two indigenous peoples, right? Where it's like um the being careful, and of course I know a lot of people might have different opinions about this, which is, does Marianas equal just tomorrow, right? And I would say it would be careful on us to make sure that that's not the case, just because for the CNMI we recognize of course the Carolinian and the Rafalawash and their languages and cultures and traditions as part of the CNMI specifically. And that's not necessarily something that you really find much in Guahan. Even though I will say people have noted down for me that, you know, and it's the same thing here in Saipan, that actually the names of villages come from Carolinian or Rafalawash words, right? If I'm not mistaken, Tamuning is one of them, right? Susupi here in Saipan, um, and I believe Garapan as well. But it's interesting, just noting those histories, those etymologies, and just thinking about when we're calling something Marianas, right? Is it inclusive of everyone who considers the Marianas home, right? Um, that being said, I love the sort of evolution of because I listen or watch your little clips of the Guambas and I do enjoy them. Um, and so I would love to see that renamed the Marianas bus. Um, and I do know, of course, inevitably we have our little island dialects, right? Um, like I know there are certain words uh in CNMI, Chamorro lexicon that are different in Guahan. I think the biggest one is, was it Patas and Otis, if I'm not mistaken, or not Otis, I'm wrong. See, I'm not a Chamorro speaker, but it's basically adding there, that's the word. Adding
Oh,
in,
I'm good. I'm good.
yeah, right. Patas, you guys use patas to refer to also human like legs,
Hooligan. Yes.
but we say adding here in the CNMI. For us in the CNMI, patas is more so like patas guaca, patas baboy, those kinds of things. But it's, those little small things shouldn't stop us though from reunifying in terms of our language. But it's also okay to acknowledge our differences. Like we can still be one and have difference. I want everyone to know that. It's very okay to be unified but still be different at the same time. Unification doesn't mean, what is it? Uniformity. Those are different things. And I want to make sure people understand that because I think it's really important to know, especially as we continue this conversation about reunification, that we don't need to be uniform in who we are and how we act to be unified. Um, but yeah, any
No,
thoughts on
yeah. Si Diyos masiguf zahu ano, unification does not mean uniformity. I love that. And it's an important thing to remember for people as they're thinking about what reunification might bring. That's such an important thing, is that it doesn't mean that there will be some things that might be lost, but it does not mean that everything is lost, right? And so yeah, because hmm, no, I like that. Zahua now. I mean, somebody should teach the United States that right now, because I think the United States is struggling is struggling with that. Not everybody, but certain people, especially some of the most powerful people in the United States, are struggling with that right now. But why now? one of the reasons why I'm eager to talk about this, and I want to have a few more conversations with others about this, but I'm glad that you've had the first, you're willing to kind of have the first conversation with me about this, is because you may recall that earlier this year there was news that in Washington, D.C., conservatives around the Trump administration had been talking about reunifying the Marianas as a state. And so this had led to kind of an interesting sort of game of telephone alaihi, where people were like, Robert Underwood kind of reported this, and then some people then, I had some friends in the CNMI who were like, "Ah, fuck, mabababay, Lunya, si Underwood, is Underwood going crazy? Why does he want us to become a state and unify as a state?" And I was like, no, 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 he doesn't want that. He's telling us that that's what they're saying in DC. And so, but it was an interesting sort of thing because suddenly, you had the governor in the CNMI at that time commented on it. The governor of the Magahaga in Guam commented on it, and so it sparked some interest in reunification, but in a very sort of peculiar way because it was spiked with statehood as well. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts. Do you remember kind of hearing about that? Because one of the things that a lot of people missed, unfortunately, in that is that the conversation from Washington, D.C. around statehood and reunification for the Marianas was for military purposes, was that they were thinking reunify them, make them a state so that we can put all of our fancy missiles there. And so that was what a lot of people missed in that conversation. But I wanted to hear your thoughts because it created some ripples.
Mhm. And so I would say, here's the sad thing. We're already reunified when it comes to the military. It's Joint Region Marianas, right? And I'll just put that out there as something to acknowledge. Um, that being said, people did have opinions. It stirred up some, the typical. I imagine it's the same thing on Guahan, where you get a flurry of op-eds and letters to the editors about people's opinions. And it was interesting because we got two different sides. We had our former governor, Mr. Juan Nekai Babalta, if I'm not mistaken, who was also our resident representative back in the day as well, who was very much in favor. I was actually pulling up the article before this meeting. And so he was like, yes, we should become a state and we should reunify, if I'm not mistaken. And then there were other people who were like, I strongly oppose reunification. Like that would be disastrous. The CNMI is so unique that if we reunify with Guam, we will lose everything that makes us unique. Um, and so I would say both sides have valid points on what would benefit us and also what we would possibly, right? And I say possibly lose and also possibly benefit because a lot of this, of course, we're talking in a very theoretical sense. The hard concrete details about what reunification would actually look like, what we would gain and what we would lose, nothing's been put to paper yet, as far as we know, at least. But it was interesting to hear, right? Like I think the general sentiment was how are people in Washington having these conversations when our own people living on these islands are not actively engaged, right, in those conversations, even amongst each other, I would say, right? So like there has not been any, outside of like this podcast and maybe our chance meetings with each other as advocates and activists in different community spaces. There hasn't been, aside from the referendum, a really serious political conversation amongst our leaders, publicly at least, about what would reunification actually look like. And to hear political leaders or government leaders in, our nation's capital actively discussing that without us knowing, at least that's what it looked like. Um, it's concerning, right? I think a lot of people here were concerned, like, hey, like, what's going on here? Because I think the big thing, and this is a very big CNMI thing, is that um, we see our territorial status as unique, and some people would say above the rest, and above Guam, right? I don't want to play this game of who has a better territorial status because I just don't think a territorial status is a good thing to have and brag about. But the argument has been made by people in the CNMI that our covenant, or the promises and agreements enshrined in our covenant are unique, and are a way better sort of position than to be administered under an organic act like Guam, right?
Absolutely.
And I would say there's truth to that. I fully agree with that. But again, if we're playing the game of who has a better colonial territorial status, I'm like, is that really the kind of game we're trying to play with ourselves? Right?
Oh,
Is that how, right? And then much less, the whole idea um, of statehood, right? Oh, there we go. You're pulling up the article. I got scared from when I thought my laptop shut off. I was like,
oh no. Dispense
uh,
again. I know that feeling.
right? Um, but
And so
yeah,
I'll just, yeah, let me just put this up on the screen for some people may have heard of it, but there's so many things happening in the world, and so I think a lot of people might have missed it. But but yeah, it
and this
was
is just this year.
yeah, it was just earlier this year, right after the Trump administration came into power, and then there was sort of this floating of this idea that the Marianas be reunified as a new state, and that it was conservative think tanks that were sort of pushing for this idea. And it was a strange sort of thing because normally, conservatives in the United States, Republicans, are not in favor of statehood for the territories, or just they tend to not be as supportive of any change in the territories. Um, I mean, look at what's happening with funding for the territories nowadays. And so this was really because of this issue of security, and not necessarily security, little bit for the islands, mainly for the United States. Sort of this idea that you make it a state, and then it extends America's wall of power. And so, because there's soft walls, there's hard walls. And so I always tell people kind of for some people know, I don't know if you're familiar with Attack on Titan, that's with the big walls. And so, yeah, so this is kind of like, they were proposing that this big, huge wall, that Guam kind of be part of like this big defensive wall that the United States is extending out across the Pacific, where like at now it's at Hawaii. But what they're thinking now is extend it to Guam and the Marianas. That's why they're building up so much. And they're even going to build up in Palau and all these other places too. And so that's part of yeah. But this is something that, is a think tank sort of idea. It wasn't something that the Trump administration was proposing. But yeah, it definitely created some. But what I found really interesting is how people in Guam and people, at least that I heard from in the CNMI, weren't were thinking about this in terms of Guam CNMI politics, not the federal government. Because they were thinking like, because some people that I spoke to in the CNMI were like, this is Guam trying to like take over. It's like Guam has nothing to do with this. Like, so, and somebody was like, Underwood, this is Underwood trying to take over. It's like Underwood has nothing to do with this. He's just came back, and he's like, what the hell? You guys won't believe what's happening in DC. It's crazy. And so, but I think that's why like this was for me, this just it really just shows that part of the more that we can help our communities feel connected. Like for me, coming from Guam, like I know that kind of the colonial experience, the thing that we struggle with is, like you're on the edge of the Western Pacific, you're in this island, but your average person on Guam imagines that they're like living in the middle of the United States. That's how they live their lives. They don't live kind of, even if they live on an island for most of their lives, they don't really live. They imagine themselves being connected to the United States in this way, in which they might as well, they feel like they're just outside San Diego or something like that. And so because of this, then it's tough because it's really hard to then think about CNMI in Guam, because even then somebody in Guam might react to the CNMI not as islands right next door, but they'll react to them like people across the border that are taking our jobs.
It's really interesting you say that because I feel like if that's, the average person sort of thought on Guam, the average person on Saipan, and of course, things are changing, right? What is average is changing actively, but my impression is that it's quite the opposite, right? A lot of people here in the CNMI imagine like, you know, they don't really to call ourselves American is like a question mark in a lot of people in the CNMI's minds. And it's interesting because the general population's impression of people on Guam is like, oh, those Americans, right? And so it's interesting that, and it makes a lot of sense now to, put into context the relationship our islands have with each other and our islands people, where if the people on Guam are seeing themselves as, more so Americans that live not really in the Western Pacific, but right outside San Diego, which does have the biggest diasporic population of Chamorros. Uh, versus the people in the CNMI who I think we do see ourselves very much like we are in the middle of the Pacific, right? And we don't really see ourselves as Americans just because Washington, D.C. is like 5,000 plus miles away, much less the edge of California, for that matter. And we see our closest neighbors, political neighbors, in this case, Tataguahan, as, Americano. And so, um, yeah, that's really interesting to see now. And I think that, light bulb moment um, explains a lot about how we talk about and feel about each other, especially when this whole big thing came out earlier this year about them thinking of reunifying us to be a state for the purposes of military security. And so interesting.
No, I mean, it can change, but I think that's why we were talking about it earlier. Part of it is, how do you get the work that's happened around culture and stuff that's kind of pushed people into a direction where I think a lot of people can say we're one Marianas, or they can say that Chamorros are one people. They can say stuff like that, but then that switches off in other contexts. It's kind of like I mean, it's one of the I would always tease like I would always tease administrators or educators like on Guam, where, like if you're like a Chamorro who's very proud to be Chamorro, you are Chamorro in one way, but then like as a Chamorro in a system, maybe you don't then maybe you feel like you can't, or you don't know how to then support the Chamorro language teachers at your school, because you also your the resources need to go to science and math and all these other things which are tied to the United States. And so, all of these sorts of things. So how, for me, one of the tricks sort of in thinking about the future of this issue of reunification is that a lot of work has happened where people feel more culturally united again. Like it's we can and as I said, the sort of cultural groups, artists, chanters, dancers, even scholars like have done a lot of work to kind of connect and create the foundation and the possibility, but there just needs to kind of be more so that your average person then when they think about when they think about Guam to the south or CNMI to the north, it's not 1,000 mental miles away. It's 40 miles away. It's 100 miles away. It's just right over there. And so this is one of the things for me that I've thought a lot about is how do we make it or how do we help the people across the Marianas understand the idea of having a shared destiny again? Because that's one of those ways that you can get people to feel the need to unite politically. So even if there's a lot of the problems that we've covered, how do you get people to feel like they have a shared destiny again, a shared purpose, right? So a lot of the work has connected us in the past. We come from the same place. But what needs to happen is looking into the future. Where are we going together? And that's a tougher thing. That's a tougher thing. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that because I know in the CNMI, I know economically things are tough right now. And then even in Guam, economically things are okay, but we're kind of getting close to where they might be an issue soon.
Mm.
I'm still trying to figure out how to mail things to the States. My goodness, there's like I went to the post office and I was like, how do I mail a package to the States? And they're like, we don't know.
I so
There's a paper out there, it'll tell you how to do
right.
it.
And I guess on the subject of our mail, where which is always a hot topic on the CNMI, because our mail always stops by at one place before it gets to us, and that's Guahan. And I would be remiss not to mention that that is perhaps a source of our tension, that our mail gets stuck in Guam for days or weeks until it gets over here. But we're still figuring out how to mail stuff over to, our brothers and sisters and cousins stateside or wherever else. But all that aside, I think the question you're asking about how can we get people to think about our shared future? How can we get people to care about a shared future? Right? That's a really hard thing. Like, what would be the unifying force to get us to see a collective future for ourselves? And I don't have a good answer, right? I would prefer to want to envision a collective future that's built on something positive. But unfortunately, the thing that's coming to my mind is, in line with what we just talked about with the article, which is the military buildup, right? It's happening. And again, it's perhaps the one place where we are reunified, right? It's joint there. It's not Joint Region Guam or Joint Region CNMI. It's Joint Region Marianas. Um, and whether you support the military or you don't, right? I think there is a shared collective concern for our environment, our cultural, um, artifacts, our history, right? I know right now in Guahan, there's a whole issue of the water wells in Zico. And I don't think a lot of people in the CNMI have really um thought super like critically about, what developments in our islands could result in similar impacts that are being felt on Guam or have been felt uh by people in Guam. But I think, that's maybe one way where we can start thinking about what are the hard-earned lessons or consequences that the people of Guam have gone through, as the CNMI is actively going through military development, the likes of which I don't think we've ever really seen before, right? Um, outside of World War II. And so I think that whether we like it or not might push us into thinking of a collective future. Because someone's pushing it for us already, I will say. And that person is the United States, right? They're planning as if we're kind of a collective, I feel, right? And so it's either we're gonna push ourselves to think in a similar fashion collectively, or we're gonna still stand divided. But if I were really to put hope into thinking what our collective future could be, um, I really hope developing our language, because the Chamorro language is there's been a lot of progress, and I want to give my flowers to people like you, Dr. Miget, and a lot of people in Guahan, but also all of our Chamorro language and our Carolinian language heritage teachers all around the islands. That they're actively doing the work to preserve our culture and language, especially as someone who does not speak it, right? But I really think our language and preserving it, and also um, reinventing it or for our future context is kind of where I see our future. And also, like, including in our language, our traditions, our values, right? Because the world's different, right? The world is very different from when our ancestors first came onto the shores of the Marianas thousands of years ago. Um, and I think thinking about what our culture, Chamorro, Carolinian, Rafalawash is going to look like now in 2025 and beyond is, I think, where to start. Hopeful note, but again, there's the military coming in that might force us to think collectively on a more, I don't want to say harmful note, but a more critical note. But yeah.
Oh, hey, bonito ano. My goodness. That was a perfect conclusion. I was just about to ask you for some final thoughts, and that was a perfect final thought from you. But we're just about at an hour's time. And so it's the way that these podcasts always work. It feels like a long time at the beginning, and then once you reach a certain point, it's like, hey, tinahong estiambi, tinahong. Siguro how. Guaha mas na bisang na rayo. Hafa, wow. Hafa, pinalokuga free speech queenie. Festi. And so, but I've Hugo Fagradesiestina, I really appreciate you coming on and getting this started because I want to talk to more people about this just to help encourage discussion and thinking at many different levels. And so I want to give you a chance now just to share any final concluding thoughts that you might have, and then we'll close the episode.
Yeah, I think my concluding thought is reunification. Um, what is it? I think it's gonna be a process, right? And it might not, I'll give the benefit of the doubt. It might not even be the right answer. But of course, reunification, the devil's in the details. How would we do it? That matters a lot more than just saying the word reunification, right? That being said, I really hope people can begin having serious conversations in the CNMI and in Guahan about what it would mean for our collective future. Because I think we need to, even just speaking as a world, we need to come together, right? But starting small, um, we need to, repair any trauma we have in ourselves and, bridge the gaps that we have with each other between our neighbors who live right across from us to people in different islands. But I really hope that people can have a serious and honest conversation about what reunification would mean for us in the Marianas, because I think it's something that we need to have. But let's be kind about it. Let's treat each other with grace, and let's move forward together is the most important thing.
Yeah, de si Zeus Masi. Biba, si Zeus Masi no hams no hogwanay, si Zeus Masi pwede fanatomo para esti na episode, and si Zeus Masi no hamzu todas ni umeegad za no umeekungok. Adios, este ki manatling
Yes.
hitalo.